Welcome to Page by Page, the podcast where we break down the most interesting stories from the world of business and finance. Today we're exploring the major headlines and deep dives from the early August 2025 issues of Bloomberg Businessweek and Barron's Magazine. These stories paint a picture of a world in flux, where established economic systems are being directly challenged by seismic political shifts and rapid technological disruption. From Washington, D.C. to Wall Street, the central theme is uncertainty. We'll look at how the White House is planning a dramatic remake of the Federal Reserve, how new tariff policies are slamming stocks and sending shockwaves through the economy, and how corporations are responding with a surge in mergers and acquisitions. We'll also touch on how these larger forces are impacting everything from the snack food industry to the job market for recent college graduates. So, let's get started. Our first major story comes from the cover of Barron's, Remaking the Fed. With Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell's term ending in May 2026, the Trump administration is preparing for a significant overhaul of the central bank. The primary goal is simple. President Trump wants interest rates to come down by a lot and quickly. But the plans being floated by potential successors go far beyond just cutting rates. Candidates to lead the Fed, like former Governor Kevin Warsh and National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett, are proposing what they call regime change at the institution. This could involve re-examining the Fed's dual mandate of ensuring price stability and full employment, cutting its staff of nearly 25,000, and even reorganizing or reducing the number of regional reserve banks. The push for reform is fueled by a critique that the Powell-led Fed made critical mistakes, particularly by allowing post-COVID inflation to spike, while initially describing it as transitory. While the next Fed chair isn't likely to be named for some time, this looming overhaul is expected to amplify the economic uncertainty that has marked the president's second term. That uncertainty is already being felt across the economy, largely due to the administration's aggressive trade policies. A Barron's headline from this week reads, "Jobs and Tariffs Slam Stocks." This follows a messy few months of tariff threats, which have finally culminated in new rates for dozens of countries. The White House has set baseline tariffs of 10% on many countries, 15% on others, and custom rates as high as 41% on nations with large trade deficits with the U.S. Since the start of the year, these policies have increased the average effective tariff rate on U.S. imports six-fold, from about 2.5% to 18.3%, the highest since 1935. The fallout is creating what one article calls a fog of uncertainty for businesses. Companies from automaker Stellantis to consumer goods giant Procter & Gamble have warned of higher costs. For a company like Japanese zipper maker YKK, which supplies 40% of the global apparel industry, the new rules create unprecedented challenges. A single car seat fastener, for example, might cross the U.S.-Mexico border multiple times during production, potentially incurring tariffs at each stage. This trade turmoil is now being linked to a significant economic slowdown. Another piece in Barron's, titled "Stagflation is Coming," points to a weak July jobs report as a sign of trouble. Non-farm payrolls rose by a meager 73,000, and the prior 2 months' figures were revised down by a massive 258,000 jobs. The author argues this isn't a prelude to a normal recession, but the onset of stagflation, caused directly by the uncertainty from the administration's tariff policies, which has led companies to hit the pause button on hiring. In response to the weak jobs numbers, traders are now betting heavily that the Federal Reserve will be forced to cut interest rates in September. Amid this economic turbulence, the corporate world is not standing still. One of the biggest trends highlighted in Barron's is a resurgence in mergers and acquisitions. Deal-making is on pace to hit $3.8 trillion this year, fueled by a resilient economy and a sense that the Trump administration will have a more lenient regulatory regime. A prime example is the recently announced merger between Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern, a deal that aims to create the nation's first coast-to-coast railroad. The tech and healthcare sectors are also seeing a flurry of activity, with large companies like Microsoft, Oracle, and Eli Lilly looking to acquire smaller firms to bolster their drug pipelines or expand their cloud offerings. This theme of corporate adaptation extends to the consumer goods sector as well. The snack food industry, for instance, is grappling with a major shift in consumer behavior. Sales volumes for snacks are shrinking, partly because of aggressive price hikes, but also because of new diet trends, especially the rising use of LGP-1 weight loss drugs like Wegovy, which suppress cravings. As a result, sales of sugary snacks like donuts and cookies have dropped significantly. In response, food companies are scrambling to reinvent their products, rolling out more protein-enriched snacks and healthier options to meet the changing demand. Finally, this issue also touches on the downstream effects of these economic shifts. For recent college graduates, the job market has become much tougher. The unemployment rate for this group is 5.8%, more than double the rate for all degree holders. The tech sector, once seen as a guaranteed path to a good job, has been hit particularly hard, with computer science graduates facing unemployment rates of 7% or higher. So, the big picture from this month's business news is one of profound change and conflict. We see a politically driven effort to remake the nation's top economic institution, a trade policy that is causing widespread disruption, and a corporate world that is rapidly adapting through massive deals and product innovation. It's a landscape of both challenge and opportunity, where predictability has become a luxury.
The stories we've just discussed from Barron's Magazine and Bloomberg Businessweek have certainly been buzzing. Following that summary, we're going to respond to the conversation by presenting a consensus, middle-of-the-road perspective on these key issues. We're going to try to find the common ground in the heated debates about the future of the Fed, the escalating trade war, and the shifting corporate landscape. First, the story about remaking the Federal Reserve has stirred the pot. On one hand, you have those who see the Fed's independence as sacrosanct, a necessary shield against politically motivated decisions that could unleash runaway inflation. On the other hand, critics argue the Fed is an unelected body that has made major policy errors and should be more accountable to the administration. A more balanced perspective suggests that both sides have a point. It's undeniable that the Fed's failure to anticipate the severity of post-pandemic inflation lends credibility to the reformers' arguments. The calls for regime change aren't happening in a vacuum. They are a direct response to a perceived failure. However, it's also true that fully politicizing monetary policy is an incredibly risky gamble. The danger isn't just about one administration getting the rate cuts it wants. It's about setting a precedent that could permanently damage the dollar's credibility. Financial markets could become deeply unsettled by turmoil at the Fed, and a chair who loses the confidence of the committee could trigger major sell-offs. The middle ground view acknowledges that while some reforms to improve accountability might be warranted, the core principle of independence from short-term political pressure is a firewall that has served the economy well. The great risk here is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The dispatches from the trade war also generated a lot of discussion. We heard from people who believe these tariffs are a necessary evil to protect American industries, and from others who argue they are an unmitigated disaster for businesses and consumers. The consensus view is that the reality is far more complex than either extreme. There's no denying the immediate negative impacts. The tariffs are creating chaos for businesses like seafood importer Sea-Scent Inc. and zipper maker YKK, making long-term planning nearly impossible. The stories of customs brokers resorting to a magic 8-ball to predict policies sum up the climate perfectly. These increased costs are almost certainly being passed on to consumers, and the uncertainty has stalled hiring decisions. However, we also can't ignore the fact that these policies are forcing a long overdue reevaluation of global supply chain dependencies. The news that states in southern India are actively positioning themselves as manufacturing alternatives to China is a powerful example of this long-term shift. This disruptive force, while causing short-term pain, could be laying the groundwork for a more geographically diverse and resilient global economy. The middle ground here is to see the trade war not as inherently good or bad, but as a messy and painful catalyst for change. The central question isn't whether the tariffs are right or wrong, but how businesses will adapt to this new, more complex reality. Finally, the stories on the corporate and social landscape also struck a chord. The bleak job outlook for college graduates feels like a systemic failure, while the Wild West-style innovation in sectors like direct-to-consumer healthcare offers a dose of optimism. A balanced view recognizes that these trends are two sides of the same coin: disruption. Yes, the job market is incredibly tough for new graduates, especially in fields like tech that were once considered sure bets. That playbook is no longer working. But at the same time, entrepreneurship is creating entirely new markets. Companies like Hims and Hers, selling cheaper, compounded versions of weight loss drugs, are pushing regulatory boundaries to meet consumer demand, even if it sparks public battles with pharmaceutical giants. This is a story of uneven change. Some sectors are contracting, while others are expanding in controversial and disruptive ways. The middle ground perspective is that this is a landscape of both immense challenge and opportunity. Success, whether for an individual graduate or a major corporation, will depend on a clear-eyed understanding of both the headwinds and the tailwinds, and the agility to navigate them. That's our take on the consensus view from this month's business headlines. It's a reminder that complex problems rarely have simple answers, and that the truth often lies somewhere in the middle. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next time with another deep dive. We encourage all of you to like and subscribe, and leave your thoughts down below.